set up the problem of d-instanton perturbation theory. And we saw that there are various issues related to infrared divergence. And we also argued that the way to resolve those issues is to invoke string field theory. So today I'll begin by giving a brief introduction to string field theory, and then I'll start discussing one particular example, okay, the simple example of a 4-point function of the collective modes, and show how string field theory can be used to tackle that case. So because we'll be interested in amplitudes involving external closed strings and also open strings, because we have to put the collective modes in the external states, we have to study the field theory of open and closed strings. But in this discussion, we'll focus mainly on the open string sector, because that's where most of the subtleties will arise. So let's denote by H the full vector space of open string states in matter plus host sector, okay, which we introduced yesterday. Okay, how to build the matter, the Hilbert space in the matter and host sector. So now what we need to introduce is the meaning of an off-shell open string field. And here is the statement: an off-shell open string field is an arbitrary element of this vector space. Now this may look a little unfamiliar, because fields normally you don't think of as vectors in a vector space. But to make connection with the usual way we think of fields, let's introduce a basis of states in H, which we denote by phi r. And in that case, we can expand a generic state in this vector space H as a linear combination of these basis states. Okay, the coefficients of the linear combination we'll call chi r. And when we say that open string field is a generic element in the Hilbert space, what one means exactly is that is the chi r's, these coefficients that are the dynamical variables of the theory over which you do path integral. Now normally what would happen is that this sum over R will also include integration over a continuous momentum, because the states in the Hilbert space will carry also a continuous momentum level. And that's what makes them into fields, because we now have a set of functions of momenta, okay, which you can think of as the Fourier transforms of the fields. However, for d-instantons, things are slightly different, because as we discussed yesterday, that open strings on the d-instanton do not carry continuous momentum. So for open strings, these are really numbers. This sum over R really is a discrete sum. Okay. So what we have here is really a zero-dimensional field theory, zero space and time dimension. So these are the dynamical variables. And now we make an assignment of Grassmann-Ellerty. So we assign that chi r's are Grassmann odd, sorry, they are Grassmann even if phi r is Grassmann odd, and vice versa. So which basically means that the state psi is Grassmann odd. Now this may again look a little odd, but this follows from the fact that if you think of the, for example, the collective mode, right, which is a physical bosonic field, the collective mode, when you represent it this way, is actually the corresponding coefficient phi r is C del x. So it's C del x, so it's Grassmann odd, because C is the ghost, C ghost. Okay, so that's Grassmann odd variable. But of course, its coefficient should be Grassmann even, because it's a bosonic field. So that's why we have this strange assignment that chi r is Grassmann even if phi r is Grassmann odd, and if it's Grassmann odd if phi r is Grassmann even. Now you also see that even though we are talking about bosonic strings, we have introduced Grassmann odd variables. Okay, and the meaning of these will become clear soon. But I hope that this definition is clear. The string fields that are variables in string field theory are basically the coefficients of expansion of a generic string state in the Hilbert space H.
Are the phi r's supposed to be on shell or?
No, phi r's are not on shell. Right? These are all states in H. So anything that you can create out of by applying with host oscillators, matter oscillators, etc., are all in this phi r, because we really want an off-shell string state.
I see. So we don't impose the constraint L0 equals 0 or things like that. So
we don't impose any such constraint on these fields. So this is really the full Hilbert space, full vector space observers.
So I can think of this psi as just starting with the vacuum and then acting with all possible oscillator modes.
Yeah, that's
And,
it. Or you can think of it by using the state operator correspondence. You can think of psi as just a vortex operator.
okay.
Arbitrary offset vortex operator.
Mhm.
Are there other questions?
So, one question. So
Yes.
psi will always be Grassmann odd.
Psi will always be Grassmann odd, yes.
Okay.
Because of this assignment. Okay, so now you have to give an action, because after all, what is an action? Action should be a number for a given string field configuration. So here is the definition of the action. Okay, I have only given the quadratic part of the action. There are also interaction terms which I have not written down, but we will see some examples later. So you see that QB here is a BRST charge, okay, which I have defined here as an integral. TM is a matter stress tensor, and this in some way is related to a ghost stress tensor, okay, but you have written it explicitly in terms of the ghost oscillators. So given a psi, okay, which means given an expansion of this kind, what the action gives is a function of the chi-r's, right? Because you expand it in the basis, sum over r phi r chi r, and you get a function of chi r, and that's what we want, because action is supposed to be a function of the dynamical variables of the theory. Now, one difference from the usual action that you are familiar with, that the string field theory action that you see here is in fact not the classical action, but it's already the master action of in the Battelin-Minkowski formalism. Okay, and I'll explain what this means. Okay, at least I'll explain in practical terms what this means. Okay, so now let's recall that we have a ghost number assignment. Notice that I have not talked about the C bars and B bars, because as we discussed yesterday, because we are looking at dealing with open string theory, so the relevant space is upper half plane. And on the upper half plane, the mode expansions of C bar and B bar are related to those of C and B. So you can only think in terms of C and B. So we had assigned ghost number 1 to C, ghost number -1 to B, and of course matter has ghost number 0. So now we are going to divide the basis of states that we had introduced earlier. Okay, this was the general basis of states. Now we are going to divide it into two sets. One set that contains ghost number less than or equal to 1, and another set that contains ghost number larger than or equal to 2. And I'll choose these phi r's and eta r's in such a way that they are orthonormal. Okay, namely, the inner product between eta r and phi s is delta rs. Now it's easy to check that if we take the inner product of two etas, it's automatically 0, and the same is the case for two phi's, and this happens just because of the ghost number conservation. So the way it happens is on the upper half plane, in order to get a non-zero correlation function, you have to have total ghost number 3. So which means that if you take inner product of two states, their ghost number must add up to 3. But if you take two etas, since each eta has ghost number larger than or equal to 2, obviously the ghost number here is at least 4, and hence this must vanish by ghost number conservation. Similarly, if you take two phi's, then their inner product also vanishes because this has ghost number at most 2. Okay. This is a constraint on the choice of basis. Okay, so we'll choose the basis in this way. And then we'll expand the string field in a finer expansion, okay, where we distinguish the coefficients of the phi r's and the coefficients of the eta r's. I'll call the coefficient of the phi r's as psi r and the coefficient of eta r as xi r. And we'll declare psi r's as fields and xi r's as the conjugate antifields. Okay, up to signs. Okay, I'll not be careful about the signs, but roughly this is the declaration. This notation is in the BV formalism, because in the BV master action we divide the fields into fields and antifields. But I'll not try to explain the general formalism in the BV master action except the part that we need. But at this stage, we shall simply take it as given that we will declare the psi r's as fields and the xi r's as antifields. So which means that the coefficients of the states of ghost number less than or equal to 1 Those will be the fields, and the coefficients of the states will Gauss number larger than or equal to 2 will be declared as antifields. The meaning of this, the significance of this will become clear soon. Are there questions up to this point? Okay, so among psi-Rs,
Ashok, sorry, just to get a intuition for what these off-shell states are. So if we start with some tachyon state with some general momentum and we act with the first oscillator alpha minus 1, the
yes.
only way the on-shell condition will be violated is that the momentum is not on-shell, right? So we just take some.
Yeah, in this case, of course, there's a momentum, right?
Right.
Because nothing carries momentum. So the tachyon, for example, is off-shell. See, tachyon is C1 in the vacuum. So on-shell condition, okay, let me go back maybe. If you look at the action, then if you forget about the interaction term, we can say that the equations of motion tells us QB psi equal to 0.
Right.
So the on-shell condition is that psi should be BRST invariant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the tachyon itself is the C1 on the vacuum.
Right. Right.
So that's off-shell because QB doesn't annihilate C1 on the vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the states are off-shell, but the on-shell states are very few in this case. Right? In fact, I mean, in the way we have set up, the only on-shell state, well, maybe not the only on-shell state, only a physical on-shell state will be C1 alpha minus 1 on the vacuum, okay, because that's the collective mode. And there's some vacuum, for example, is physical. Right? Vacuum is on-shell, but most of the states are off-shell. C minus 2 on vacuum, for example, is an off-shell state.
So if we have a tachyon state with the momentum satisfying the p squared equals m squared for the tachyon, that is not considered on-shell in this?
No, that is on-shell, but there is p is identically 0 here, right? Because on the d instanton, we cannot put any momentum.
I was referring to if we don't have a d instanton.
Yes, then yeah, exactly. Then p square equal to p square plus m square equal to 0 will be the on-shell states because those will be BRST invariant.
Right. Okay.
So all the on-shell states that you are familiar with will satisfy the linearized equations of motion, and they will be declared on-shell. Everything else is
okay. Thanks.
that clear? Okay. Okay. So psi-Rs, as we have declared, these are the fields. But among these, there are also states that multiply Gauss number 1 states. These are called classical fields. These are called classical fields because the physical fields that are familiar with are in this sector. Because, for example, the collective mode, we said that corresponds to the state C1 alpha minus 1 on the vacuum. Right? But corresponding vortex operator is C partial X on the vacuum. That has Gauss number 1. So that belongs to the classical fields. The ones which have Gauss number less than or equal to 0, these correspond to, in the usual formulation, in the usual way we are familiar with, these correspond to ghosts that are associated with gauge transformation parameters. Recall that when you gauge fix Yang-Mills theory, right, there is a ghost and an anti-ghost. The ghosts are in one-to-one correspondence with the gauge transformation parameters, and anti-ghosts are related to gauge fixing terms. In this case, all the states of Gauss number less than or equal to 0 effectively correspond to the ghosts that are associated with gauge transformation parameter. So these states are in one-to-one corresponding to the gauge transformation parameters. And the anti-fields will play the role of anti-ghosts in the usual formulation. However, there is a crucial difference between the usual formulation because here in the BV formalism, we already have ghosts before gauge fixing. Normally in the Fadia-Popo formalism, the ghosts arise after gauge fixing. In the BV formalism, we start with all the fields at the beginning. So we already have the ghosts before gauge fixing because so far you have not talked about gauge fixing at all. Right? This is a full action that you have to do. And the role of gauge invariance is played by what is called the BV master equation. Okay? The fact that normally we start with a classical action which is gauge invariant and then start gauge fixing. Here you have introduced already the ghosts and the anti-ghosts from the beginning. So the role of gauge fixing is, or role of gauge invariance is played by the fact that this action S satisfies the BB master equation, which I have written here. Here R and L denote left and right derivatives, but otherwise I think it's pretty explicit what this identity means. And this identity follows from the various properties of QB. Okay, first of all, to leading order, this identity requires QB square is 0, and then the interaction terms have to be chosen appropriately so that that identity holds. Okay, and string field theory interaction terms do obey that identity. Are there questions?
Where does this equation come from? Or what? Sorry, could you say a bit more about this master?
Where does it come? Okay, this is the general BB formalism. This replaces the concept of gauge invariance in the BB formalism. But in string field theory, the leading order contributes. At the leading order, only this part contributes. And this basically follows if you take this action and apply these various derivatives. This will follow from the fact that QB square is 0. The other contributions, okay, will come from the interplay between Q and the interaction terms. And physically, they basically correspond to, when you translate it physically, they basically correspond to the fact that the string field theory Feynman diagrams cover the moduli space in a one-to-one fashion. So that, so that it captures that fact that when you actually compute Feynman diagrams from string field theory, the moduli space is covered in one-to-one fashion.
Okay, thanks.
One question. So if when we solve the BB master action and get the string field theory action, do we get the interaction terms as the 1PI effective one or the full thing?
No, for the full thing. The 1PI effective action will satisfy similar equation, but without this last term. Okay, the last term is a full BB master equation, and you get the full thing, not just the 1PI effective action. Okay, so now let me give the rules for path integral. Okay, because I said that we have not gauge fixed yet, right? We have not even talked about gauge invariance. Okay, the role of gauge invariance is played by the BB master equation. Okay. But in the BB formalism, the rules for path integral is that you have to integrate over a Lagrangian submanifold weighted by the usual weight factor into the action. Now, I'll not try to give a general definition of Lagrangian submanifold, but I'll give some examples, and that's good enough for our purpose. So here is an example of Lagrangian submanifold, that for each pair of field and antifield, we either set psi r equal to 0 or set xi r equal to 0. Namely, you either set the field equal to 0 or set the antifield equal to 0. There are more general Lagrangian submanifolds that you can consider, but for our purpose, this is good enough. And what BB master equation guarantees is that the physical quantities are independent of the choice of the Lagrangian submanifold. This is a statement of gauge invariance, that the final result, all physical quantities are independent of whether you set psi r equal to 0 or xi r equal to 0, as long as you make sure that for each pair, we set 1 to 0 and not the other. So this is the rule for computing path integral in a BB formalism. Okay. And this is the rule you have to follow in the context of string field theory. Namely, that after you have expanded this, evaluated the action for this configuration, now we set in the action either psi r equal to 0 or xi r equal to 0, and then integrate over the rest of the variables. So to see what it means, let's first take the Lagrangian submanifold as xi r equal to 0, which means you are setting all the antifields to 0. Okay, and let's see what it means in terms of path integral. So the leftover fields then are all the fields are the psi r's, and these include the classical fields. Okay, those are the host number 1 fields, and then all the host number less than or equal to 0 fields, which are the ghost fields associated with gauge transformation parameters. So what we are left with are classical fields and the host fields associated with gauge transformation parameters. And now if you evaluate the action, which involves these plus interactions, we can see that, well, we can see it easily for the kinetic term, but this is also true for the interaction terms, that this depends only on the classical fields. And this happens just by ghost number conservation. Because you see this, if you look at psi QB psi, QB has ghost number 1. You have to have total ghost number 3 in order to get a non-zero result. So if psi has ghost number 1, that's the classical field, then the total ghost number adds up to 3 and you have a non-zero result. But if any of them is a ghost field, right, which means ghost number 0 or less, then it's impossible to make up total ghost number 3 from this. And this property holds also for the interactions. So the action depends only on the classical fields. So the situation we have now is that the weight factor e to the s depends only on the classical fields. And we do path integral over the classical fields. This is the usual path integral, but before gauge fixing, because the action written in terms of the classical fields is gauge unfixed action. And now the integration over the ghost fields can be interpreted as division by the volume of the gauge group. It's division by the volume of the gauge group because the ghost fields, I have already said that these are in one-to-one correspondence to the gauge transformation parameters. But these have opposite graspability, right? Because the ghost fields, for example, the ghost number 0 fields are Grassmann-Orr. So their integration, so they are in one-to-one correspondence with the gauge transformation parameter, but their integration, instead of giving the volume of the gauge group, gives the inverse of the volume of the gauge group. So integration over the ghost fields you can reinterpret as the division by the volume of the gauge group. So in a sense, formally this is the correct path integral, because what you have is the integral over the classical fields with gauge invariant action, weighted by gauge invariant exponential of the gauge invariant action, divided by the volume of the gauge group. So formally this is the correct path integral, but of course in presence of gauge symmetry this is somewhat singular because you have not gauge fixed. So there is nothing wrong with this description. In fact, often in lattice gauge theories one does this kind of analysis. We don't gauge fix, we use a path integral over all fields and then divide by the volume of the gauge group. But for perturbation theory it's usually not good because you will not get a non-singular property. So formally this is correct, but in practice it's hard to choose a gauge fixing of this kind, where you set all the antifields to 0. Are there questions on this?
Yeah, can I ask a question? So, in the discussion so far, you have implicitly chosen a boundary condition to define open string field, right? For say instantons with different instant number, you will have a different boundary condition. Do you have in mind now you have fixed a particular choice?
Yes. So when you do the instanton perturbation theory, you fix the instanton number and you do the perturbation theory around a given instanton background.
Okay, so now in either bosonic string theory or say in the type 2B superstring theory with the d-instant anti-d-instanton, there's an open string field configuration where the tachyon condenses and d-instanton disappears. Is that supposed to be included in this open string path integral?
I think that will be non-perturbative, right? If you include the full non-perturbative contribution, I think that may be included. But if you do perturbation theory, then of course you will not see this.
Okay, so the open strings are just treated perturbatively here.
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So this formalism is set up to do perturbation theory around a given background.
Thank you.
Okay. So now let me go to the gauge fixing that we normally use in string field theory. That's a Siegel gauge fixing. So here is again the expansion of psi with this orthonormality condition. And now we'll make a further specification of the basis states. We'll choose the basis states such that either of these two conditions hold. It's always possible to choose the basis states this way. That either B0 annihilates phi r or C0 annihilates and C0 annihilates eta r or vice versa. So phi r and eta are conjugate states. So you can always choose basis states so that phi r is annihilated by B0 and eta r is annihilated by C0, or phi r is annihilated by C0 and eta r is annihilated by B0. So here I have given an example. For example, you can choose, for example, phi r as C1 on vacuum. This one is annihilated by B0 because B0 annihilates vacuum. The corresponding conjugate state eta r will be chosen to be C0, C1 on vacuum, which is annihilated by C0 but not by B0. Or we can take phi r as C0 on the vacuum, in which case C0 annihilates phi r, and eta r as C minus 1 C1 on vacuum, in which case B0 annihilates eta r because B0 anti-commutes with C's and annihilates the vacuum. So it's always possible to choose the basis states in this way. Basis states phi r and eta r in this way, that either B0 annihilates phi r, C0 annihilates eta r, or vice versa. So now we make the following choice of gauge. We set zeta r equal to 0 in this case. Okay, if the choice of basis, if the basis states phi r eta r satisfies this condition, we set the antifields to 0. If the choice of basis state satisfies this condition, we set the field to 0. This is also a Lagrangian submanifold because I said that for every pair you have to either set the field to 0 or the antifield to 0. That's a perfectly good choice of a Lagrangian submanifold. But if you choose the Lagrangian submanifold this way, then this means that B0 annihilates psi identically. Because you see B0 on psi is psi r on B0 phi r. What we are saying is that if B0 phi r is non-zero, as in this case, we set the corresponding coefficient psi r to 0. Or if B0 eta r is non-zero, B0 eta r is non-zero in this case, then we set the corresponding xi r to 0. So in this gauge fixing, psi satisfies B0 psi on equal to 0. Okay, that's the single gauge. And now if you evaluate the action in this gauge, okay, it takes the simple form that it's half psi C0 L0 sandwich between two psis. But psi, of course, is a gauge fixed. Okay, it satisfies this condition, B0 psi equal to 0. So L0 here is the total Virasoro generator. Okay, so Tm plus T host is expanded at Ln z to the minus z minus 2. Are there questions on this?
Ashok, so on the previous slide, we had CR equal to 0 for all R, right?
That's right, yes.
And so here we are saying that somehow for each R, you have to make this choice that you had on the next slide for each
That's
index
right, yes.
R. But
Yes.
you cannot make just the first choice, let's say, for each R. What
Or
decides for which R we make which choice?
what decides? See, I mean, as I said, the BV master equation guarantees that we can define a Lagrangian submanifold by choosing either psi r equal to 0 or xi r equal to 0 for each pair.
Mm-hmm.
So what I described here, this choice of Lagrangian submanifold, where you set all the antifields to 0, this is, in a sense, the starting point of the path integral, that you define the path integral over all classical fields and divide by the volume of the gauge group. So this is one limit of the BV formalism, okay, where you don't gauge. This corresponds to not gauge fixing, okay, in the usual formalism, okay, but we integrate over all the classical fields and divide by the volume of the gauge group. But as you know, this becomes singular when you try to apply perturbation theory, right? Because gauge field, for example, don't have a propagator. Its propagator is singular. So it's correct formally, but it's not. It's hard to implement, right, in perturbation theory. So what we are saying is that now is the following, that because BV allows us to use this, that we can either set psi r equal to 0 or set xi r equal to 0, we will now choose a different gauge in which we set xi r equal to 0 or psi r equal to 0 depending on whether this is true or this is true.
Right, but okay, thanks.
Right, I mean, just because in normal string field theory, this makes the propagator invertible, right? Because C0 L0 now can be has an inverse, which I'll describe in the next slide.
Okay, thanks.
So once the kinetic turn has this form, then you can define its inverse, which is B0 L0 inverse. And unless L0 equal to 0, which is when you sit on the pole, this is a perfectly good propagator. And that's what one normally uses for computing amplitudes in string field theory. And now this L0 inverse using the Schwinger parameter representation can be rewritten in this form. And it is in this form that one makes connection with the worldsheet formalism, because now this operator q to the L0 has a nice interpretation that this is just scaling by q in the worldsheet formalism. And this, using this, one can recover the usual worldsheet description of the amplitude. Okay, and we will see later how this is done. But now, when you specialize to the case of d instantons, we see again that the divergences, this integral is divergent from states with L0 less than or equal to 0. Okay, the right hand side. Left hand side, of course, is divergent only for L0 equal to 0. Okay, so this is the same kind of divergence that we encountered yesterday. So here are the divergent terms. The tachyon, for example, corresponds to L0 equal to -1. That's the state C1 on the vacuum. Because this is L0 equal to -1. And for this, this side, this integral will be integral dq q to the -2. This is, of course, divergent integral. But you are instructed to replace it by -1, which is the right hand side. Right? L0 inverse is -1. So you are supposed to replace it by -1. L0 equal to 0 states have to be treated separately because those are divergent on both sides. And one particular class of L0 equal to 0 states are C1 alpha -1 on 0, which in terms of the vortex operator is this one. And this indeed is a 0 mode associated with collective coordinate associated with the X translation. Okay. Time translation, for example, has a collective coordinate whose corresponding state is this. And we have discussed here yesterday how to deal with this case. We basically have to remove these from the internal propagator and do the integration over the collective coordinates at the end. That's what he had said. And this is how we will treat divergences for these L0 equal to 0 states. However, now the problem is that open strings have other L0 equal to 0 states in the Siegel gauge. And these come from the ghost sector, leading to additional 0 modes. And here are they. These are annihilated by B0, right? So they are in the Siegel gauge. And you can clearly see that they have L0 equal to 0 because oscillator numbers add up to 0. So these states are not the usual collective coordinates. And these cannot be treated using the procedure that we described earlier. If we leave them untreated, then they will lead to logarithmic divergence in the loop amplitudes, okay, because these actually propagate in the loop. And so we need to find a new approach. So basically, because they are L0 equal to 0, left hand side, of course, is infinite. In the worldsheet formalism, this will give logarithmic divergence because you will get dq q inverse. And unlike these, which have to be subtracted, for these, we have no justification to subtract that contribution. Are there questions? Oh, so the solution here is to consider the full expansion in the L0 equal to 0 sector. Okay, and I'll leave out the C1 alpha -1 on the vacuum because that you already know what to do. I have included the ghost sector. So the full expansion in the L0 equal to 0 sector has, these are the fields, okay, because these have ghost number, this has ghost number 1, this has ghost number 0, and these are the anti-fields because this has ghost number 2, this has ghost number 3. Okay, and all of these, as you can see, has L0 equal to 0 because oscillator numbers are up to 0. So the Siegel gauge choice that we made, that corresponds to setting psi1 equal to 0 and psi2 equal to 0, okay, because these are the ones which are not annihilated by B0 because of the C0 presence of the C0s. So this we have seen is problematic. So the solution that we will take is to go back to the original choice of Lagrangian subspace, okay, in the 0 mode sector, that is to set the antiphase to 0. So instead of setting using the gauge where psi1 is 0 and psi2 is 0, we will set psi1 equal to 0 and psi2 equal to 0. So in the 0 mode sector, the expansion of phi will now have this structure. Okay, this doesn't satisfy Siegel gauge condition, but we will see what it gives. So here is the expansion again, and I have thrown in also the tachyon for reference, okay, because it will be useful later. Now, if you substitute this chi in the expression for the action, there's a kinetic term. This is a tachyon kinetic term, which is this corresponds to m square equal to -1. But now we see that the psi1 now has got a quadratic part. Psi2 doesn't appear in the action. Psi2 doesn't appear in the action, and in fact, it doesn't appear in the action at all because it has ghost number 0. Okay, and so by the argument of ghost number conservation that I gave earlier, that once you integrate out all the heavy modes, okay, one can see that just by ghost number conservation, psi2 completely decouples from the action. So now we are in business because if we use this form of the action, then psi1 has a non-vanishing kinetic term. So this then has a finite propagator, and will normalize the propagator as -12. In the convention, in the tachyon propagator is -1. Okay. This half t square will take as having propagator -1. So because the half is missing here, this propagator is half of the tachyon propagator, so that's -1. Sorry, minus half, because the propagator is the inverse of the kinetic operator. So psi2, I have already said, has no kinetic term, so it's a 0 mode. But it decouples from the action completely by ghost number conservation. To see what to do with psi2, we have to see what is the physical interpretation of psi2. So physically, integration over psi2 corresponds to a division by the volume of the gauge group, because psi2 has ghost number 0, right? And as we have already discussed several times, the ghost number 0 states are in one-to-one correspondence to the gauge transformation parameters, and integrating over these modes correspond to dividing by the volume of the gauge group. But the volume, the gauge group here refers to the rigid U1, possibly after a field redefinition. It corresponds to rigid U1. See, all D branes has a U1 living on them. But for D instanton, because the open strings do not carry momentum, the U1 symmetry actually is rigid. It cannot depend on any space-time coordinate, because there is no space-time coordinate in the open string field. So it's rigid U1. Because of this, we don't have problem with the kinetic term. Okay, there is no non-invertible kinetic term. Okay, unlike in the case of a U1 gauge, a genuine U1 gauge, local U1 gauge symmetry, because that will give rise to 0 modes in the kinetic operator. Okay. So integrating over psi2 corresponds to division by the volume of the rigid U1 gauge group. Okay, again after the field redefinition. And so integration over psi2 factorizes, and that can be dropped. Because basically what we are saying is that the rigid U1 gauge group has a finite volume which we are dividing by. But let's just not worry about dividing by this finite volume. That's just a normalization factor. So after an appropriate field redefinition, that makes psi2 as the parameter of the rigid U1 gauge transformation, we simply drop the integration over psi. And now we have a well-defined perturbation theory, because the field psi1 has a well-defined kinetic operator, and the field psi2 doesn't appear in the action, and its integration over psi2 is dropped. So this is the procedure that we are going to use to carry out perturbation theory in presence of D instantons. Are there questions?
Is there any space-time interpretation why the zero gauge choice led to some additional divergences?
Yeah, okay, space-time interpretation is, let's see these kinds of, so as Nathan was saying yesterday, that if we had, say, normal gauge theory, we have the ghosts and anti-ghosts, which are massless fields, right? And you have integration over those massless fields, even in a normal gauge theory. But you don't worry about integration over massless fields, because their propagator is 1 over k square. And you know how to deal with those propagators. They go give apparent integral divergence, but at the end, everything cancels. But for D instanton, 1 over k square is really 1 over 0, right? Because k is 0. And that's what gives rise to this divergence. If you want to know the physical reason for this divergence, right? I mean, you can think of it this way, that this integration over psi2, we know that it corresponds to integration over rigid U1 gauge group, and that's of course finite volume. But at the level of the algebra, we don't see that the gauge group has a finite volume, right? We only see the integration over a real number, and that can be infinite.
I see.
Okay, so that's the physical way to see why you have apparent problem with the Gauss zero modes.
Okay, thank you.
That okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to clarify one thing. So in this zero mode sector, you're using a different gauge choice other than the Siegel gauge, right? Means.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
But that's possible because, as I said, if you go back to the choice of A, right? That what did I say? For every pair, right? We have a choice. We can either say psi r equal to 0 or xi r equal to 0.
Okay.
We don't have to make a general rule for every r. Right? So for every r, you can either set this to 0 and that to 0, and that's what you are doing here. In a zero mode sector, we are just using a different gauge than Siegel gauge.
Okay.
So let me now translate to the algorithm on the worldsheet. So this says that we basically remove all logarithmical divergent integrals of the form integral dq by q, including those that come from the Siegel gauge Gauss zero mode pairs I1 side. This in fact makes our life simple because this says that whenever you encounter a divergence of this form, a logarithmic divergence, you just subtract it out. We don't have to worry about whether it comes from the collective mode or the Gauss zero modes, because every such divergence has to be subtracted out, because collective modes are subtracted out because they have to be integrated at the end. The Gauss zero modes are subtracted out because you are not using Siegel gauge. Okay? So the I1 psi2 pair, whatever divergence it gives is subtracted out. But then we have to explicitly add the contribution from the psi1 probabilities, because this is something that you don't see in the worldsheet formalism, right? Because in the worldsheet formalism, which comes from the Siegel gauge choice, psi1 doesn't propagate. So this contribution has to be added explicitly, and we will see in various examples that unless you add the psi1 contribution explicitly, you get the wrong result. In fact, you get results which are not sensible. And finally, this is important, okay, although I have said it in a few lines, okay, we'll see that most of the headache is here, okay, in doing actual computation, that you have to account for the required field redefinition of the zero modes and the contribution of the measure that generated during the field redefinition to the amplitude. Because when you carry out field redefinition, the measure that there is Jacobian factor in the measure, and you have to keep track of the Jacobian, because that can be exponentiated and thought of as an additional correction to the action, and that can contribute to the amplitude. So this has to be taken into account. So this is the full algorithm that we'll follow in dealing with divergences on the worldsheet. Are there questions? Okay, so let me now turn to example.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
How do you ensure that the resulting path integral is correctly normalized after these subtractions?
That the resulting path integral is correctly normalized?
Yes.
Okay, so the overall normalization we will not worry about, okay, because string field theory by itself cannot fix the overall normalization, because you can see you have weighted by e to the s, right? If you add a constant to s, nothing changes. So that has to be figured out separately, okay, maybe from unitarity or something else. But otherwise, there is a field dependent normalization that is ambiguous, because the BV formalism gives you the full field dependence of the normalization. Okay, the integration measure has no ambiguity, right, except for an overall constant, which is just an additive constant in the action. Okay, so that you will not be able to fix from the kind of analysis that I'll be describing in the later part of the talk.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so here is the first example that I'll be considering, which I've shown you many times. Okay, but now we'll try to see how to compute it. So 4-point function of translational and zero modes. So let me remind you again that the amplitude that we had is this one, and after evaluating the correlation function, we got a simple integral of this form. And the problem is that this diverges at y equal to 0 and at y equal to 1. And our goal will be to show how to get a finite unambiguous value of this integral. And the strategy that I have already said several times is that you have to change variable from y to q near the singular points, replace the divergent integrals of the form integral dq 0 to 1 dq q to the minus 1 plus h by 1 over h if h is negative. Well, if h is positive, then there is an identity. Okay, so there is nothing to replace. And by 0 for h equal to 0. Okay, because all the 0 mode contribution is been subtracted out. So that's the procedure. That's the procedure that will follow. Okay, so before we go on, let's see what we expect. Okay, where the contributions are going to come from. So for this, let's distinguish the vortex operators. See, in the previous one, all external states are the same. Okay, so you cannot distinguish them. So let's just, for distinguishing the external states as 1, 2, 3, 4, write the amplitude in this form. So we insert W1, CW1 at the first at 0, W2 at y, CW3 at 1, and CW4 at infinity. So what we expect is that when y comes close to 0, this will be covered by the S channel diagram of this kind, because 1 and 2 are coming close. You can see when y comes close to 0. So y goes to 0 will correspond to the q goes to 0 limit of this diagram. Okay, so q is the q variable, the Schwinger parameter associated with this propagator. And when y goes to 1, that corresponds to 2 and 3 coming together. That will correspond to q goes to 0 limit of this diagram. Okay, this is the U channel diagram. And then the rest of the region in the y space between 0 and 1 will be covered by the contact interaction. This has no divergence. Okay, this has no q that is going to 0. Okay, so this has no divergence. So this will cover the part of the y integration region from where there is no divergence, so which is away from 0 and 1. So we need to find how much region each diagram covers. Okay, so this diagram we expect will cover some region near y equal to 0. This diagram we expect will cover some region near y equal to 1. So you have to find out how much region each diagram covers so that we know how much this covers. And then for these diagrams, you have to know the change of variable near y equal to 0 and y equal to 1. Okay, so that's the goal. So here is in a nutshell the problem. Let's suppose you have a Feynman diagram with an internal propagator. The question is how to translate the Schwinger parameter q associated with the propagator to y, okay, the variable y that we had in the previous slide, the integration variable. Okay, so that's the problem that we want to study. Now to calculate this, we have to make a choice of the off-shell 3-point vortex of 3 open string states with unintegrated vortex operators, which are denoted by V1, V2, and V3. Now here I have emphasized this word vortex because one shouldn't confuse this with vortex operators. Vortex operators are operators on the world sheet. When you mean 3-point vortex, okay, this is like the 3-point vortex in Yang-Mills theory. Okay. If you have 3 fields, okay, what is the coupling between the 3? That's what we mean by 3-point vortex. And like in any quantum field theory, where the 3-point vortex or any point vortex, any time in the action, is specified for off-shell external fields. Right? We don't put on-shell condition when we write down the action. Okay? And so hence the vortex, when we write down the 3-point vortex, we have to specify it for off-shell 3-point vortex. Okay? Similarly, here we need to specify the off-shell 3-point vortex of 3 open string states. And you see the need for it from this Feynman diagram, because these lines are on-shell, but this is off-shell, right? This is an internal state. So unless you have the off-shell vortex, unless you know the vortex, the 3-point coupling for off-shell external states, we cannot compute this diagram. Now, in a sense, it's clear that this will be related to a 3-point function of the V1, V2, and V3 on the sphere, right? 3-point coupling between V1, V2, and V3. But of course, this result, this expression, depends on Z1, Z2, and Z3 in a non-trivial way, unless each Vi is a dimension 0 primary. Yeah, and if each Vi is a dimension 0 primary, those are the on-shell states. Okay. So for on-shell states, a coupling of this kind doesn't depend on the choice of Z1, Z2, Z3. But when you're trying to specify an off-shell interaction vortex, this depends on Z1, Z2, and Z3. So what we need is a systematic characterization of the choice of the vortex. And this is what I'll try to do in the next slide. Are there questions on this? Okay, so here is a way to systematically specify what is the off-shell 3-point vortex. So we choose what are called local coordinates, which are denoted by W1, W2, and W3, near the 3 points Z1, Z2, and Z3, where you want to insert the vortex operators V1, V2, V3. And you have to specify a relationship between these local coordinates W1, W2, and W3 with the global coordinate Z, which in this case is on the upper half plane, right? Because we are talking about 3-point function, 3-level 3-point function. So this should be related to the 3-point function on the upper half plane. So Z we'll consider as the global coordinate on the upper half plane. And you have to specify the relationship between the local coordinates W1, W2, and W3 with Z. So these functions, FIs, are the string field theory data. So here I have said the different choice of the FIs lead to different string field theories, but one can show that all of these different string field theories are actually related by field definition. So let me say something more about this. So the relationship between Z and Fi and Wi is this, and these functions FIs are chosen in such a way that the location of the vortex operator, location of the puncture, ith puncture, is always located at Wi equal to 0, which basically means that Fi of 0 must be Zi, right? So in the Z plane, the ith puncture is located at Zi. In the Wi coordinate, the ith puncture is located at Wi equal to 0. So this function must have the property that Fi of 0 is Zi. And now the idea is that in order to specify the off-shell 3-point vortex, we insert the vortex operator Vi in the Wi coordinate system. In practical terms, this means that the off-shell 3-point function between 3 external off-shell states, V1, V2, and V3. Okay. So when you talk about, okay, maybe I should have said this before, that because there is a one-to-one correspondence between the string fields, okay, which are the coefficients of expansion, okay, and the states, okay, which are the states which the string field multiplies. Okay. I'll use interchangeably, okay, the word string field and the vortex operator. When you talk about representing a string field by a vortex operator, that basically means that I am talking about, when you talk about a string field, is the coefficient of that particular operator in the expansion of the field. Okay, so that sense, this is the sense in which you are specifying the off-shell 3-point vortex. So f dot v in this expression is a conformal transform of v under f at w equal to 0. Okay, because f dot v is 0. So in particular, if v is a primary of weight h, then f dot v of 0 is as f prime of 0 to the power h times v of f0. Okay, so because primary fields transform nicely under conformal transformation, and this is a transformation of a primary field. But in general, VIs are off-shell, there can be secondaries, and this is complicated. Okay, and we will see some example in the next slide. Finally, S refers to symmetrization, because the vortex should be symmetric under the exchange of V1, V2, and V3. So this is symmetrization under permutations of V1, V2, and V3. So you have to put F1.V2, F2.V3, F3.V1, and so on. Are there questions?
So suppose hello. Yeah, so suppose we do this thing for generic off-shell fields, and then we put the on-shell condition. Does the F1 dependent, F1, F2, F3 dependence go away? Means like you said that.
Yeah, because F dot V then becomes as V, right?
Yeah.
If you put on-shell condition, then H is 0 because
okay. Yeah, okay.
it's a dimension 0 primaries.
Right.
So F dot V is as V, and you recover the previous expression that this is just V1, Z1, V2, Z2, V3.
Okay.
On shell, it gives us the usual amplitude, but off shell, this is the way you specify the 3-point coupling. Is that clear?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Okay, so here is some more example. Suppose you have the field C of W. Then F dot C is given by f prime of w inverse c of f of w, because c is a primary but it has dimension -1. That's why this -1 factor. What about f dot, the derivative of c? So this can be computed by taking the derivative of f dot c. Because f, of course, is a operation that acts on c, right? The derivative can be taken outside. This is derivative with respect to w. So this is del w of this. And now you can carry out the derivative. So when this acts on c, by chain rule, you bring out an f prime of w. So that just becomes del c evaluated at f of w. Here del refers to derivative with respect to its argument. And then when del acts on f prime of w inverse, it gives this extra piece. So f dot del c of w is given by this complicated expression over here. And similarly, we can figure out how what this symbol stands for any general operator. Okay, we basically, because every operator basically can be thought of as secondaries of some primary, and using that we can figure out how it transforms under f. Okay, so in our analysis, we will make a particular choice and then do the calculation, and here I have given the choice. So I'll first describe its properties and then specify how I made this choice. So here alpha and gamma are constants, and we'll take alpha to be large in the sense that I'll throw away all terms which have inverse powers of alpha. Because as we have said, the final results of all physical results should be independent of the choice of x. And alphas or gammas are just parameters in f. So you expect that the final result should be independent of alpha and gamma. And I'll use that knowledge to say that I'll take alpha to be large and I'll throw away inverse powers of alpha. This is just for simplification. In principle, you can do the calculation exactly for generic alpha.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes. How did we know that we need just two parameters like alpha and gamma, not three?
Yes, I'm going to explain this. I'm going to explain this, right? Why this? Okay. Let me explain these properties and then I'll explain why only two parameters.
Okay.
Okay. So what are its properties? That in the z plane, right? You can see that three punctures are at. So f1 of 0 is the location of the first puncture. I have chosen f1 of 0 to be 0. Right? If you say w1 equal to 0, it's 0. f2 of 0 is 1. Okay, because these two cancel. And f3 of 0 is infinity, right? Because w3 is 0, so it's infinity. So I have adjusted this so that the punctures are at 0, 1, and infinity. Okay, that's a nice convenient choice. So that already says that I have limited the parameters in some way. The other property that these functions have, which is not, you have to do a little bit of calculation to verify this, that if we take this SL2R transformation, z goes to 1 over 1 minus z, this cyclically permutes this 0, 1, and infinity. Okay, you can easily see 0 goes to 1. Okay. So 1 goes to infinity because 1 minus z is 0, and infinity goes to 0. But you can also check that this cyclically permutes f1, f2, and f3. So in a sense, once I have specified f1, then f2 and f3 are automatically fixed if we demand that this property holds. So you have to now ask, how did we fix f1? Because I demanded that f1, f2, f3 should be cyclically permuted. That's a convenient property that will be useful for us. With this, once you specify f1, f2, and f3 are fixed. Now, how did we fix f1? So first, I chose f1 to be a SL2R transformation. This makes life infinitely simple. Okay, as you will see, it's not necessary. Okay, in string field theory, there is no reason why these functions should be SL2R transformation. In fact, most of the elegant formulation of string field theory uses things which are not SL2R transformation. But for practical computation, one finds that SL2R is much simpler than a generic function. So F5s are then, I chose F1 to be an SL2R transformation. Now SL2R transformation has three parameters. Okay, because it's like AW plus B over CW plus D, but then it's AD minus BC equal to 1 condition, so it has three parameters. Now one of the parameters is fixed because we are demanding that F1 of 0 should be 0. Okay, because we want the Z1 to be 0 and then Z2 and Z3 to be 1 and n. This is again a matter of convenience. So one of the parameters in F1 is fixed, right? That's why in the numerator there's no additive constant. So these leaves are the two parameters, and the alpha and gamma are basically those two parameters. So this is the answer to the question that how did you choose this particular parameterization. I tried to make it as general as possible. At the same time, I tried to make it so that the life doesn't become unnecessarily complicated. So I chose an SL2R transformation and cyclic symmetry, and that basically fixes the structure completely. Are there questions? Okay, so maybe my 1 hour is up, but let me just show one more slide to describe how we relate Q and Y.
Ashok, we had many questions, so feel free to go further if you want. Do whatever you think is appropriate. Don't worry about
Okay, maybe I'll go a little bit farther. Yeah, so let's see how far we go. Okay, so here is the way we find a relation between Y and Q given the FIs. So we take two copies of the upper half plane. Why two copies? One for each interaction vortex. If you had a more complicated diagram, here there are two interaction vortices, right? So you basically have to choose one for every interaction vortex. Okay, so for this particular diagram, we have two copies of the upper half plane. Okay. So you take two copies of the upper half plane, and you call their global coordinates Z and Z prime, and related local coordinates. Okay, there are three local coordinates on the first copy of the upper half plane, three local coordinates on the second. Via the identification W2 W2 prime equal to minus Q. Okay, my computer says the internet connection is unstable. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, it just stopped for a few seconds.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the second step is that we now glue the two surfaces via the identification W2 W2 prime equal to minus Q. This I'll not try to explain where this comes from, but this is basically what the Siegel-Gauge propagator does. The fact that the Siegel-Gauge propagator has this minus L0 inverse, which we express as integral dq q to the minus L0 minus 1, translates to this statement that we have to glue the local coordinates via an identification of this kind. Now here I have just chosen W2 for convenience. I could have chosen any other coordinate. So maybe one important point I had missed in the last slide. Okay, this is the last statement that I didn't explain. See, because we have chosen this 3-point vortex to be cyclically symmetric, and because if you look at the diagram, right, these states are identical. Okay? This is different, but these states are identical. Similarly, these states are identical. Okay? So cyclic symmetry of the vortex implies that even without explicit symmetrization, the vortex actually is fully symmetric. So this symmetrization you can drop. If we didn't choose cyclically symmetric vortex, then you have to explicitly do this symmetrization. So that's the advantage that we have by choosing the vortex, these functions to have the cyclic property. Okay, it's just that it reduces the number of terms that you have to compute. Okay. So here is a point. So we glue the two local coordinates by W2 W2 prime equal to minus Q. Okay. And if the vortex had to be symmetrized, then you have to also average over W2 being replaced by W1 and W3, and W2 prime being replaced by W1 prime and W3 prime. So this gluing, because W2 is a function of Z prime, W2 is a function of Z, W2 prime is a function of Z prime. So this gluing relates Z to Z prime by some kind of functional relation. And this functional relation, as you will see, is easy to find when these maps are SL2R. If these maps are not SL2R, then finding this functional relation requires actually solving differential equations. Whereas for SL2R vortex, we can just get here by solving algebraic equations. So in the new upper half plane, you can describe the new upper half plane either by Z or Z prime, doesn't matter, because they are related by SL2R transformation. So in the new upper half plane, the external vertex operators will be at Z1, Z3. Okay, so puncture 2 has already been glued. Okay. So the external vertex operators are Z1 and Z3, and also at Z prime 1 or Z prime equal to Z1 and Z prime equal to Z3. So that corresponds to FZ1Q and FZ3. So you have a new upper half plane in which you have 4 vertex operators inserted at these 4 points. We now bring 3 of them to 0, 1 and infinity and declare the 4th one as y. And this is what will give the relation between y and q. Now you can ask where this prescription comes from. Okay, as I have already said, I'll not try to explain in detail how it comes from, but this prescription follows from properties of conformal field theory and the form of the Siegel gauge propagator that we have given, that is B0 over Nc. Okay, are there questions? Yes.
Yeah. So you used the fact that you are fixing the three of the vertices at 0, 1 and infinity by taking the form that f of that form, right? You used and you got that you have only 2 parameters, alpha and gamma.
Yeah, so that's in the form of vertex. See, in any in the upper half plane.
Okay. Yeah.
See, in the upper half plane, you can always choose the 3 vertex operator, 3 points are 0, 1 and infinity by an SL2 transformation.
Yes.
Right. So that you can always do.
Yes,
right.
yes.
Whether they have 3 points or multiple points. So here, 3-point vertex, this was a choice. I made the choice that the 3 punctures are 0, 1 and infinity. But what I'm saying here is that, see here after you have glued, right? Punctures are at Z1, Z, which can be 0 and infinity. Okay? But these are of course arbitrary, right? These are complicated functions. Okay? But you can now make a further SL2 transform, bring them to 0, 1, infinity, and then the 4th one you call y. The reason that you want to do that is because the way you have written the integral.
Okay. So that we get that form y square 1 minus y.
Okay. So because these vertex operators are 0, y, 1 and infinity, right? We want to bring 3 of them to 0, 1 and infinity. Okay, so that's the reason why after you have gotten the vertex operator in the upper half plane, you want to bring 3 of them to 0, 1 and infinity. Is that clear?
Yeah. I was just thinking whether we are overusing that fact, but it's okay. It's clear now.
No, we are not overusing the fact because on any upper half plane you can do that. Right? Okay. That's a SL2 transformation, right? All amplitudes are invariant on SL2 transformation. That's the global symmetry of the upper half plane.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now the point is once you have found a relation between y and q, right? The range 0 less than or equal to q less than or equal to 1 will correspond to a certain range of y. So this will be covered by Feynman diagram with an internal propagator, and rest of the region in the y space will be covered by the 4-point contact interaction. Maybe I can stop here, but maybe I can go a little ahead because this may be too abstract, and I think once you see an example, it will become much clearer, right? So maybe I'll show 1 or 2 slides and then I'll stop. Okay, so let's now do it for this choice. Okay, F1, W1, this is the choice we have made. And remember that what this F's do is that it relates the global coordinate in the upper half plane Z to the local coordinates W1, W2, and W3. So the first what we are going to do is to invert these relations, right? So Z equal to F1 or Z equal to this. Can we invert it to write W1 as a function of Z? Because these are SL2 transformations, so inversion is easy. So here are the inverse relations. W1, W2, W3. And now if we glue them by saying W2, W2 prime equal to minus Q, right, we get this identity between Z and Z prime. Once you have this, then we can see where the external vertex operators are. See, the vertex operators at 1 you have glued, right? W2 equal to 0 corresponds to Z equal to 1, and this is Z prime equal to 1. So the external vertex operators are now at Z equal to infinity and 0. These are the remaining vertex operators of the Feynman diagram. Okay, if you go back, so what we are doing in terms of diagram, right? This is like 0, infinity, 1, right? 0, infinity, 1. the one we are doing. So 0 and infinity in the z plane remains at 0 and infinity. But these in the z prime plane, of course, are at 0 and infinity, but you have to translate them into z plane because you have to say in one coordinate system where they all are. Right? And that's what we are doing here. Okay. So the punctures are at infinity and 0, and z prime equal to infinity and z prime equal to 0. You can easily see that if you set z prime equal to infinity, that translates to z equal to this, and if you set z prime equal to 0, that translates to z equal to this. Is this procedure clear? And so now all you have to do is to scale these to bring one of them to 1, and then whatever the other is, we'll call it y. So let's look at this a little bit more. Okay. Z has been placed at infinity 0 and these 2 points. We see that if we take large alpha or small q, then these 2 punctures are close, right? Because when q goes to 0, for example, this is 1, this is 1. Both punctures are coming close to 1. So these 2 punctures are close. So if you want to find a relationship between q and y near y equal to 1, okay, this is the situation, y nearly equal to 1. What we need to do is to make an SL2R transformation. So the vertex operators are at 0, 1, infinity and y, with y close to 1. Okay, which basically means that this should go to y and this should go to 1. Okay, because this is infinity 0, this should be 1, because this one can check is on the left of this. So infinity 0, this should be y, this should be 1. That will give the T channel, U channel diagram. If on the other hand you want to study what is the relationship between y and q near y equal to 0, okay, that's the S channel diagram. We have to map these points in such a way that this goes to 0, this goes to 1, sorry, this goes to 0, this goes to y, so that 0 and y now come close together. Okay. And then by cyclicity, if this goes to 0, this goes to y, this should go to 1, and this should go to infinity. So here are the maps. Here are the SL2R transformations that does this. So the first transformation is just a scale. That's clear, right? Because it's infinity 0. This should be y, this should be 1, right? So all you have to do is to scale z so that this remains at infinity, this remains at 0, this goes to 1, and whatever this goes to, you'll call y. So you just scale, and the punctures now are at infinity 0, y, and 1, where y is given by this. Second one is a little more tricky. Okay, that will give the y nearly equal to 0. Here we make an SL2R transformation of this kind, and that brings the punctures to 1, infinity, 0, and y. Okay, and y now is given by this formula over here. Okay, you can see y by the definition is whatever is the left one, or whatever is left, right? Because once you have placed 3 of them at infinity, 0, and 1, the 4th one has no choice. That's something that will come out as a function of q, right? Like under the scaling. So this scaling, what it does is to make this one 1, okay, but then you have to just take whatever you get for this one. That we declare as y. So this is the way we determine the relationship between y and q. And you see here that for large alpha or small q, this y is indeed close to 1, right? 1 minus q over alpha square. And here you see again that for large alpha or small q, this y is close to 0. And I had shown you one of this formula. I think this formula is what I had shown you in one of the earlier slides. Yeah, this is the way we derived it. So maybe I'll stop here. Next time we'll use this to actually evaluate the amplitude. We'll show that this is 0, and then we'll turn to the BRY formula, which in a sense is more interesting because we are looking for something that is non-zero. Okay, so I think I'll stop here and I'll pause for questions.
One question. So this gluing fixture that you had W2 prime equals to minus Q or Q, whatever.
Yes.
So that
minus
you said follows from the Siegel gauge, right? Means
That's
or
right, yes.
what the Siegel gauge does.
Yeah.
So in the case where you have the vertex operator, one of them say the zero mode, where you cannot use Siegel gauge, then how do we get
Yeah.
the
So
plumbing
the
fixture?
description we have said, right, is that those have to be subtracted out, right?
Okay.
So what we'll do is that after you do this change of area, right? See, suppose you make this change of area,
Yeah.
then we express the
Yes.
integrand as an integral over Q.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Right.
Then if you encounter an integral like dq over Q,
Yeah.
just throw it away. Because you have said that we are going to remove all the zero mode, right? That's the prescription we arrived at.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
The zero mode contributions are removed, right? So it will show up here as integral dq over Q. And the procedure you have suggested will just throw away that integral dq over Q, irrespective of whether it's coming from the corrective mode or the gauge zero mode. And we will treat them separately, right? As we have discussed. Is that point clear?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Right? And the psi one we have to take into account separately, right? And we'll see in the next lecture how to take into account the psi one.
Ashok, a
Could
question? Oh, I'm sorry. Perhaps I can ask a question. You have here an expansion of Y in powers of Q, and for the answer, do you need all terms in this expansion, or the leading term, or the first two terms, or how much do you need from this expansion?
Yeah. So the point is, if you want to do the result for generic alpha, then you need all terms in the expansion. But we'll evaluate it for large alpha. Okay, that basically corresponds to adding large stubs in the string old language of string field theory.
I see.
That will require expansion only up to this point, because we'll throw away all negative parts of alpha that we get in the integral.
I see. Thank you.
But yeah, we can in principle keep the full expression, right? Make the change of variables and do the integral, and the final result is guaranteed to be independent of alpha, because we know that the string field theory result shouldn't depend on alpha.
I see. So if you took the Witten vertex, we don't know those terms there, that expansion, is that right? Or
That's right. Yeah. The Witten vertex, I think you know this exactly. If you take the Witten vertex and do this 4-point function, I think Giddings had written down this expansion exactly.
Right.
So you have to use that.
Okay.
But that's a bit singular, because in Witten vertex, the S and P channel basically coincide.
Right.
Right? They fill the whole diagram. So I think that doing this with Witten vertex may be a little more complicated. Although it may be possible. I'm not completely sure.
I see.
In fact, okay, maybe it will be possible. I think, yeah, I don't think that will be complicated. We'll just have to integrate Q from 0 to 1. Right? And you will see that there is nothing left over.
Right. Yeah, it should be possible.
It is possible. Yeah. In fact, this Berkovits-Snabel calculation, the original calculation, probably amounts to using Witten vertex and doing this kind of calculation. Yeah, they are thinking in terms of tachyon potential.
Right.
But that can be reinterpreted as doing this kind of calculation.
I see. One last question. In terms of the gauge fixing condition, what you have shown in some sense is that two different Lagrangian submanifolds kind of either give different answers or one is singular. Is that right?
Well, they shouldn't give different answers. Oh, I mean, okay. One is singular in the sense that it's like 0 by 0 form.
Okay.
Right? I mean, it's what happens if you have gauge unfixed path integral. In the BV formalism,
right.
If you set all the antifields to 0, right? It's
right.
I say that it's wrong, but it's like in somewhat ill-defined form.
Good. I see. Good. So it's analogous to that example of the path integral just with classical fields and those. Right. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wanted a related question. Can you say a little bit more about just that relation of the gauge fixing of the ghosts? I was also curious about that.
The gauge fixing of the ghost?
No, exactly what Barton was asking about. You're saying that there's an analogous, it's a 0 over 0. Can you say a little bit more? I think you said during the lecture, but it was a little too fast for me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, see, if we take the Lagrangian submanifold as setting all the antifields to 0, right? Then what happens is that you have the integration over the classical fields, okay, and the ghost fields that are associated with the gauge transformation parameters. That ghost fields, as you know, actually correspond to division by the volume of the gauge group. Okay, because the ghost fields actually decouple from the action now, because just by ghost number conservation. So what we have in the numerator is just integration over the classical fields, which is, which in usually is a singular integral, because the path integral over classical fields includes the gauge direction, pure gauge direction, right? And that's singular. So you know the kinetic operator, for example, is not invertible. That in turn is supposed to be cancelled by the division over the volume of the gauge. That's what the ghost fields do. So it's like infinity in the numerator, infinity in the denominator, and they are supposed to cancel. And indeed, in the lattice gauge theory, that's what people do. In lattice gauge theory, you have to try to do the path integral. You don't have to gauge fix. You can do this integral by sampling and divide by the volume of the gauge group, and you get a perfectly sensible result. But if you want to do it in perturbation theory, then you get a singular expansion because the kinetic operator is not invertible. That's why you have to do a different gauge fix, like the Siegel gauge in usual string field theory. Is that so? That's a generic statement for a generic string field theory.
You said something about the volume of the U1. That's the part that it's
something about, yeah. Okay. So now the point is, let's look at the situation here. Here, the gauge group is rigid U1, right? Because on the D instanton, there is a U1, right? Every field on the D instanton is neutral under the U1. To see the effect of the U1, you have to bring another D instanton close to it. Then the open strings that stretch from the one D1 to one D instanton to another D instanton transform under the U1. So there is a U1 gauge symmetry, the hidden U1 gauge symmetry on the D instanton, but every field on the D instanton is on the single D instanton is neutral under the U1. So it's a trivial factor that we have. Right? So because every field is neutral, now the presence of that U1 actually doesn't introduce a zero mode in the classical field, classical center. So you don't have to gauge fix, right? The Siegel gauge, we are familiar with Siegel gauge condition. That's a remnant of the fact that you are forced to gauge fix for a general deep end, okay? Because of this, otherwise you will get a zero eigenvector of the kinetic term. Here you don't actually have that problem. But here, if you use a Siegel gauge, you have the opposite problem, that now the ghost zero modes are not sensible, right? It's not clear what the ghost zero mode integrals do. Okay, and that's what we see here, right? These modes. See, normally these would not cause a problem. So these modes normally wouldn't have caused a problem on a normal deep end because they will be carrying momentum, right? And they will have propagator which is 1 over k square. Here these cause problem. Right? So the Siegel gauge becomes singular because momentum is strictly 0. But here, if we go back, the gauge unfixed version, right? What I mean by gauge unfixed version is this one, where you take the Lagrangian submanifold to be IR equal to 0. That actually is not singular. And the reason is that the presence of the U1 gauge symmetry doesn't make the kinetic term for the classical fields non-invertible. Right? Because under rigid U1, classical field doesn't transform. So there is no zero mode in the classical field set. And that's why we are going back to the original gauge choice or the gauge unfixed version in the zero mode set. Okay, that we choose this gauge in the zero mode sector. Well, this is a choice of gauge from the BV formalism. If you are using the usual VRST formalism, then you will say that this is the gauge unfills version of the cosmic.
Okay, thanks.
Is that clear?
Yeah, I think it is clear. Thanks. Satanta, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a question regarding this this identification W2 W prime equal to minus Q.
Yes.
So, is there any specific reason of choosing W2, or
No,
could we
no, there is no specific reason. Okay, let me go.
Okay.
Come to that. Right. As I have said, you have to actually average over all these permutations.
Okay.
I chose as W2 just for convenience, but for this particular choice, right, because of the cyclic symmetry of the vortex,
Okay.
and because of the fact that we have two external states identical, we don't have to do this cyclic permutation. Right? We could have chosen any of the WIs. Right? They will give an identical answer. If you had taken W1 prime equal to 1 or W1 W2 prime equal to 1, right, the final answer will remain the same because the vortex is automatically cyclically symmetric.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So if it was not cyclically symmetric, you have to do this permutation. Okay. So there is nothing specific about W2 here.
Okay. Actually, W2 appeared a little more complicated than W1 or W3, say. After using the inverse relation.
By SL2R. See, they are all related by the Z plus 1 minus Z, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you can repeat this analysis with W1 prime, or W1, W3 prime, anything that you like. And you will find that ultimately you want to go back to the Z hat coordinates, right? See, in the Z coordinate, the punctures will look different, right? Because, for example, if you have glued 0, right, then you have infinity 1 and then 2 other points here.
Right.
But by the time you have gone into this standard form, right, not this one, this one, that you have placed 3 of these at infinity 0 and 1, then the Y will always be the same. Okay, whether you start from W2, W2 prime or W1, W3 prime or anything else, right, by the cyclic symmetry of the vortex, you will get exactly the same relation between Y and Q in all cases.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Can I ask a question as well?
Yeah, sure.
So should we be thinking of the different values of alpha and gamma as being related to field redefinitions in the final answer?
Yes.
Or how?
Yeah. So different values of alpha and gamma are correspond to different string field theories, but they can be shown to be related by string field redefinition. So for all physical answers, the dependence on alpha and gamma should go away. And
okay, great. So it would make sense to just take specific limit and then the answer would be exact, presumably. If you take like alpha to be infinity, then the answer should be exact.
Exactly, yeah. So the point is that we want to keep as many parameters as possible because you want to check that you have not made an error, right? Because if you have made an error, then the final answer will start depending on these parameters. So one check that your final answer is correct is that the final answer should be independent of these parameters. So it's a balance between how many parameters you want to keep, right? And how complicated analysis you can handle. Okay, so you want to make it sufficiently complicated, but nevertheless, I mean, you want to make it simple enough so that you can do calculation.
That's great. That's great. Thanks.
And we will see many examples of this in later, particularly in the BROI analysis, right? We will see that there are various parameters we enter in the intermediate state. Okay, in fact, whole functions enter in the intermediate state. But at the end, the dependence on those functions drop off.
So, like you said, in the off-shell case, the vertex, the 3-point vertex will depend on these parameters. Like we saw, it will depend on F1, F2, F3. But the final amplitude you are saying should be independent of the parameters. Is it?
Exactly. Final amplitude for on-shell states. See, the final ultimately what you are computing is the amplitude for on-shell states, right?
Yeah.
But the external states are all on-shell. That is C del X, right?
Oh, okay.
The intermediate state is off-shell. That's why we need the off-shell.
Okay, okay, that's when you get. Oh, okay. All right.
Are there any more questions? Okay, so if not, let's thank Ashok again. So we'll stop recording now, but people are welcome to stay online and ask Ashok in private, whatever they want. Okay, so see you all tomorrow. Thanks.
Thanks.